All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. I'm here with Casey Muratori of Handmade Hero Incorporated,
Hello.
where he makes only the finest handmade heroes. Oh, we got to get your image up again.
Do you want me to send you the video feed again?
Yeah. Send
Okay.
that
You
again.
sure you want me to send you the
People, they might not know who you are.
video? All right. Good
So,
luck.
like,
If this tanks your
all
computer.
right. So I'm clicking. I'm, I'm doing all the. No, that was pop out. That was wrong. Okay. No, we're fine. Um, and then I'll go back to the video, the game. Oh, the game is struggle busing more,
Yeah, of
but
course.
actually, no, the game is fine. It's OBS is struggle busing more. Whatever.
Yeah. You need one of these new Ryzen 7 APUs in your system, John, for
Yeah,
extra
I'm sure
threading.
that'll help.
A thread
That'll
ripper.
help
You could
so
rip.
much. Dude, most of my CPU cores are doing nothing right now. Okay, let's just point that out.
Well, multi-threading is hard.
Yeah.
It actually is hard. So that doesn't bode well.
That is true.
So what's up, John? You said you
Yeah.
wanted to talk today about water, and I'd be
Yes.
like, water is hard, man.
Well, it's hard normally. Um, Fortunately, well, I don't even know where to start talking about this. Um, let me give a little bit of an intro for the people.
Okay.
So sometimes I work on video games. Um, so one of the games that I am working on right now uh, has this kind of a situation where you walk around in a grid world and you sort of occupy one grid square at a time, and there are puzzly things that happen. So like I could push stuff around and I could push stuff across the water, and then this lily pad can go in the river, and then I can get on that thing and I can ride it for a while. I can get off and I can push this rock into the water and it can change the course of the water. So there's like a whole game here with uh stuff that you do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it's a pretty well defined game in the sense that, well, in several senses. So one, it's a very kind of an abstract game that operates on grids, and so you could have the same game for the most part with like terrible graphics, right? But part of what we're doing in this project is having nicer graphics, for several reasons, I guess. One is, well, because it's fun to do that. It's fun to make a game with good graphics. Another is people will actually pay you to play your game if it has good graphics. But lastly, what I have discovered a long time ago is that graphics actually really matter. They're not a separate thing from gameplay. Like what your mind is doing when you play a game is in part responding to what you see, and those responses will be different depending on what you see, right? And so for these reasons, I've always felt that it matters what your game looks like, right? Like early on, uh, I don't know, earlier in history, and also probably still, some indie game developers believe that like visuals don't matter, and like it just matters if your game is a good game in terms of some actual abstract rules or quote mechanics unquote or whatever. I hate that word. I don't hate the word, but I think it's a good word. Um, and that's, I think it's demonstrably not true. And some games that I work on, that's even less true than other games. So for The Witness, it's extremely not true.
Yeah.
Like if you just accidentally put a bug in the shader to make the colors a little bit different in The Witness, part of the game becomes unplayable, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's like, so clearly these things are coupled to some degree. But part of the reason I was doing that stuff we did in The Witness is because it was becoming clear that they have a lot to do with each other always in every game.
Well, since
Right?
people like analogies to things, I mean, I would hope that most people wouldn't say like, well, if the script for a movie is good, then you don't need cinematography or good actors or any of that stuff because, the viewer will just hear the words of the script and understand that it's like a great film or something. But it's like, but that's not what a film is, right? Like a film
Yeah.
is many things coming together to make an overall effect. So you would assume that unless you think games are somehow magically different than all other media, it matters how all of the pieces are interacting. And the best examples of things in that media should be things where every single element that media has are all working together for the same end, right? I mean, that's what makes a great game as opposed to a great game design. And those are different things and should be considered different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that doesn't even necessarily have to do with budget or whatever, right? I'm rearranging our cameras and it's hard to talk while
Yeah.
I want more of a pure situation here.
Yes, I was
These
basically
are
subsuming you. You were becoming very
okay.
very eclipsed by my very presence.
Okay. This is about as close as I'm going to bother to get it right now. So people who are OCD are freaking out about the mismatched cameras. Um, so yeah, whatever. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that completely. And it doesn't necessarily mean in terms of talking about games that the budget has to be high, right? Like there's different types of things looking nice, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the Michael Bay, it's full of explosions, right? And then there's like, well, you can pick a game like, I don't know, Monument Valley or something
Mm-hmm.
where
Yeah.
objectively speaking, it's not like a trillion hours went into modeling the levels or something, right? But it's like they picked an art style and a color scheme.
Yeah.
It's well art directed.
Yeah.
Art direction goes a really, really long way,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so forth.
Yep.
So, yeah. Um, so, for all these reasons, and many more, uh, we want the graphics in this game to look good. And, early on, I didn't worry about that. Early on, it was just like, hey, we just make a grid. It was the whole engine was 2D actually in the very beginning. And I started implementing, the rules, and then gradually we bulked it up. And then sometime probably before the first year was out, it started going 3D. And then it was just like, well, we have this game with 2D bitmap tiles. The first step in making it 3D is to just put those on each face of a cube, and now we're drawing cubes, right?
Yep.
So it literally started there. This whole engine. So this engine is being made in a new programming language, and so there was zero code in the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't a like license Unity and buy some stuff on the asset store kind of a situation. It's we're building this up literally from nothing. So um, and part of that is also figuring out exactly what is the game that we're making, because I sort of knew in the beginning, but then as you work on it more and more, you get more of a concrete idea. So like the river stuff that I just showed, and dropping rocks in the water and all these things, like there are a lot of nuances. Like in the beginning, you think, well, what? You have to be able to drop rocks in the water, but there's a lot of nuances that have to be decided, like between having that high level idea and finishing the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at this point we're far enough along that I think we know most of those and we can start doing stuff. Anyway, so right around, someone's asking why didn't I use the Witness engine, because it's in C++ and it's made for first person games, and this is a third person game, which looks very different, right?
And I mean, to be fair, it's not like you didn't move code over, right? I mean,
yeah, no, we did. That actually accelerated things a fair bit.
yeah.
The fact that we did
Yeah.
move code over, I just brought the game up real quick.
So, that the you don't have to reuse an exact engine to still get a lot of reuse out of stuff that you've developed.
Yeah.
I mean, the editor for this game looks very similar to the editor for The Witness because
It is. I mean, so that editor actually goes back to
Happy Cake, right?
Happy Cake, which nobody will know what that is.
That's all right. They can look it up.
It actually goes back to a thing before Happy Cake.
Yeah, was it Gall stuff?
Gall stuff,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay, all right.
So lots of side projects that people will not know what they were. Okay, so we can start getting a little bit concrete at this point after that great amount of background, I guess. Anyway, so around the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, I was like, water is important in this game. There's a lot of islands in this game, right? Even if there weren't, we want nice looking water in some of these other scenes to sort of like, because we have settings that are, in watery places. And well, okay, let's say one more thing about this game. And this is an idea that still has not come to fruition, but one of the high level ideas was like, look, this game was chosen in certain ways. Like because I knew that we were building a game from scratch, right, with a new engine, then I wanted to limit how much we needed to do in certain dimensions to have a feasible game. So for example, in The Witness, you have like infinite view distance. We had to like LOD all these things and like combine meshes into clusters and like try to paint the shadow map data into the mesh by vertex past a certain distance and get rid of texture data and all these things that you do to make a first person game run faster. With this game, part of the design was like, oh, this will be a good project because the camera is always on a localized place. Like you can see here, if I just pop the game to the top for a minute, the camera there is looking down at a limited scene. And so if you decide like per square of world, what is the most dense that can be in terms of triangles or number of textures or something, then that puts a cap on how much your engine ever has to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you don't have to worry about certain things, right? We could focus on building certain kinds of capability in the engine and then worry about other things like, okay, maybe that'll happen when we do a first person game again, right? Now, it's not that simple because we do have side views on some of these levels and whatever, but for those particular levels, you just don't give yourself a problem, right?
And you still have a much more bounded problem than you had before because you're like, look, I still know I'm looking at it from roughly this far away. I still know I'm only looking at it across this angle spectrum, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah, you have a lot more control with this kind of game.
Whereas first person, it's like, oh, dude, the player is going to walk up all and everything. And
yeah. And so part of that was, wow, so if we want to make a game that looks really nice, because we have this very well-controlled view, like it's so controlled that it doesn't even scroll most of the time. Like we have some levels that scroll, but they scroll between known positions even.
Yep.
So it's like, it's very, very controlled.
Mm-hmm.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to turn off the air conditioning. I have this modern air conditioning that, much like computers, it won't ever do the right thing.
Yep.
So you have to
we have one of those here. Yep. We have one of those here.
Back in a second. So I will have to turn that back on in like probably an hour or something.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I was thinking was, hey, since we're programming an engine for this thing and the game has relatively limited scenes, we could go kind of over the top when it comes to certain classes of graphical effects, right? Like, hey, we're going to have light beams in this game, and we're going to have a lot of water and whatever else, like crystals, like all these things. We could just go kind of insane in terms of how much pixel horsepower we spend on doing those effects,
mm-hmm.
right? Because we sort of have that budget. That said, we have to not get into a situation where we end up having to put in all the engineering effort that I was just saying we were going to save, right?
Yeah.
But because you kind of can't, like, yeah, you have a limited amount of engineering effort to produce the game with, right?
Yeah.
But it's always been the dream to like do some really nice effects. And maybe it's kind of dumb because they're small on the screen or whatever, but maybe that also lets us make them really nice.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that is the history. Now, we haven't done most of those yet. We do have some limited effects that are pretty nice. So if I bring the game back up here, I mean, they're not like beyond standardly nice, but we've got some of the basics. So like there's this crystal I'm next to, and if you like stare at it, you can see that it's doing some fake
refracty kind of things. Yeah.
refraction. It's sampling the frame buffer and whatever. And that I did some water stuff this week, so that works even if I drop it into the water. So it's actually like still refracting underwater, which may matter on some levels. And it's all you can't see it that clearly because the water layer is in front of it, but there's this nice depth fade on the thing and all that. So we're starting to do some of these things. But as you can see, also the water is very basic. I have these like circle-like particles moving around. We'll talk in a minute about what's going on there. So about a year and a half ago, I said to some people on the team, like, hey, it's probably time to get more serious about the water. And we built up from the relatively minimal infrastructure that we had at that time. We built up something that actually looks nicer than what is currently here. Right.
Okay.
So what you see right now is not the best that this has ever looked.
Okay.
However, some of the things that we did were experiments that, whereas they looked better in the moment, I felt like these are not exactly on the path to what we actually want to do. Because what I felt we were ending up with was we were ending up with a lot of, like, I didn't have a ton of time back at that time to like run. So I would like send people some emails saying, here's a description of what we need to do. Let's talk about what that would be, just so that I'm not very vague. So there are gameplay requirements, like I've just mentioned, right? You need to do the things in the gameplay that I just mentioned. And so because it's a puzzle game, that also requires clarity. So for example, on this screenshot, you see it's pretty clear where these gameplay rivers are. I could make it more clear very easily by tinting this, but so there's this particle motion, but especially the color right now, which doesn't look very fancy, like the color. I would not describe this as a high production value way of coloring the rivers, but it's at least very clear, right? And that clarity cannot be spoiled, or it's something that we need to have control over at all times, right? So if we beef up these graphical effects, it cannot be in a way that makes it like ambiguous in some levels when you're playing where is the river and where isn't. And so one of the things we were doing was we have so let's talk about part of what we have now is that we have this fluid simulator running in the background here, which is where some of this stuff is coming from. So, we seed it, for example, with the flow directions of the rivers. And in this case, not with anything else, although you could maybe vertex paint some preferred flow directions. We had some mechanisms for that. And let me pop up a little HUD here where, okay, so this image in the lower left is a shadow map, which is maybe not that relevant. But the level, the image just next to it is, it's a fluid sim buffer. It's a little bit minified. The actual texture, I think, is 2K by 2K pixels. And it's a 4-component thing. I forget, I could point people at the paper that this is, except I don't remember which one it is. It's a 4-component texture where X and Y are flow direction, and then Z and W, and I don't remember in what order, but they're like pressure and vorticity, right? So it's an interesting piece to have under the hood. But we used to be doing a lot more with the output of this fluid simulation than we are doing right now. So for example, we were rendering, instead of this coloring of the rivers that we have right now, that is based on just basically sampling the gameplay, the gameplay data of what happens to an entity when it goes into the square is exported via a different texture map that we're actually not drawing here right now. And then that's just being sampled when we draw the water plane, right? Currently. And the reason for that is because it's very clear. And we used to actually be sampling the fluid simulator, right? And then thresholding the thing, hey, if the flow amount is greater than something, then color it river colored, otherwise don't. And that was a little bit more organic, but it also it wasn't very controllable, and it didn't look nice, right? And so it wasn't, and you could then try to maybe filter that on the back end to try to make it look more nice. but you're in the situation where you're starting with data that doesn't fundamentally look that nice
Mm-hmm.
and trying to produce data that looks nice by filtering it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a very good position to be in sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
it just wasn't working for me, the things that we were doing there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's actually turned off right now. There's some other stuff. So there was, I guess this came from some papers or something. There used to be an element in here that uh, involved, um, what do you call it? Oh, geez, our
What do you call what?
OBS is not happy again. um, it involved like convecting colors around in a secondary texture map,
Uh-huh.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So parallel to this one uh, on the right here, there would be another texture
Yeah.
map that I think was the same size. It was just like some
Yep.
colors, and that was a way of like doing ocean flow. And we did that, and it looked cool in the abstract,
Uh-huh.
but it looked like ink spreading
Yeah,
around no
which
matter
is,
what
it's
you
always
did.
going to look like that. I mean, that's the only thing it can look like, really.
Yeah, and I was like, this doesn't actually look like anything we want,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So let me talk about the high level mission statement of what do we actually want,
Uh-huh.
right? So we want not ambiguous for gameplay,
Mm-hmm.
sexy video game water, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does sexy video game water mean? Well, it means it responds to lighting, right? In a nice way. It means it's actually kind of 3D. Like we did lots of prototypes of stuff where we were doing sort of a more 2D illustratory water.
Mm-hmm.
And we had some stuff that looked kind of cool, but like it was very 2D. And if you're making a 3D game where you have like 3D lighting and the player is trying to gauge where things are in space and all these things,
Mm-hmm.
then the more that you do in 2D, it's both a stylistic clash and it makes the game harder to play sometimes
Mm-hmm.
because it's more difficult to judge things.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so there's always this balance of gameplay and looking nice. And so some of it you see, so on the water that you see right now, we have this grid in the background, and it's like not the nicest looking grid yet, but it's got some elements of what we want, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's not like a texture map just projected down there. It's being generated by a noise function.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's got some other noise function multiplied against it so that it's not like a constant, really annoying grid.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to play, you can tell where the squares are, and so if you need to know if something is 8 squares away across the ocean or
Mm-hmm.
not, you can know that, and it's not a problem,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And so we want water that looks really nice, like you would see in like a demo of something, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
High powered, high technology water, but that doesn't ruin gameplay, right?
So, based on that description, can I ask a couple questions?
Sure.
So the first question I have is, as a game design, is this the kind of game where at some point the player is going to be presented with a piece of water, like a pool of water, with a block blocking the mouth of the water that they can then move and watch the water flow out into something else?
Well, maybe. But okay, well, there's two versions of that, right?
Uh-huh.
So one is, does the water level of the top pool change,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, are we actually doing volumetric transport,
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
conserving? And the answer to that is no.
Okay.
But there's a related answer that is yes, which geez. After we finish this piece, I want to take a bit to set up the windows in a little bit of a better way here. But I can go to this other level where, for example, we have this elevated pool.
Thank you. This is what I was asking, basically.
Yeah,
Yes.
but it's not the water, I don't think, ever drains out of this pool, but things can go from above to below.
But
right?
Okay, but my question here, a little more specifically, is: does that happen dynamically? Meaning, could there have been a block in that 2 square empty spot that you then move so that the user has to see the water come and fill in the area, even if it doesn't drain out existing water? Can they see movement of water in a 3D way, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, well, okay.
Is that something that's going to happen in this game?
Probably to some degree. So a
Okay.
related thing, so what we're doing in this game is we're starting from on the gameplay side is we're starting with a set of gameplay elements, and then we're um, e- exploring the way they interact and sort of expounding on the consequences and doing everything that, well, everything reasonable that those things lead to, right? And so,
Yes.
um,
Otherwise known as the John Blow method of game design.
something like that. I don't want to be typecast, man.
Too late.
But so one of the things was, we had all these puzzle mechanics that were defined in 2D, and then we're extending them to 3D, right? And so water was one of the basic things, and so extending water to 3D is, I wasn't going to do it, and then we had a request from someone working on the game to do it, and then I was like, you know what, I like doing stuff, so let's do it.
All right.
Okay, but that, so the 3D part of it is in mid implementation, right? So like last week you couldn't even have two water planes visually.
Right.
Now you can, and it sort of does it correctly, except like the flow map data between the two levels is shared right now, or like the rendering isn't totally separate, right? But for example, so you see how there's this upper plane, and where it goes down, there's sort of a gap edge, right? So at the very least, that needs to be water going down. And in fact, there's two possible things it could be, because right now there's a gameplay river. And so you kind of want to see a gameplay river going down, right? But it also could be a non-flowing at the edge, but then there's still water there, right? Because something could, like this lily pad would be able to go off the edge, right? Like whether there was a river there or not, if it was going in the right direction. And so you kind of still need maybe like an infinity pool, like very slight amount of water over the edge, right? So there's at least two things that could happen there. But then if there's river over the edge, we have this thing where you can disrupt rivers, right? And so the river then has to be able to stop flowing. And if you have a situation like this, where let's say, again, this is going to be a little bit confusing because of the bottom layer, but let's say you have a river that's being fed from an upper level and drops to the lower level. It looks like it's in the lower level also, but that's because, again, right now we can't have separate river stuff. If you have that situation, then you sort of want to be able to disrupt the river up here. And then this river elimination that happens flows actually down the waterfall and down to the bottom, right? That would be the thing to do. But
wait, that is actually erasing the whole river.
Yeah, well, it's because the level is set up invalidly. Okay. What's actually happening over here is not actually valid gameplay state, but we don't bother to, this is how this level should be set up to be correct. You're like not allowed to have a rock in a river at the same time. So what'll happen is it'll erase it up until it hits an obstacle.
I see. Okay.
Although actually that's a different bug. It's a different bug when it started erasing the whole loop, because it should have seen the other side feeding in.
I guess that doesn't matter from the perspective of what we're dealing with. I was just curious what was happening.
Yeah, that last erasure wasn't supposed to happen. I actually just fixed some water bugs this morning that had to do with, again, this rewrite that I was talking about to do multi-layer. It's in progress, right?
So so the term fixing water bugs could either refer to what you were doing or like neutering those little things that like live on the surface of the water.
Well, I said I was going to mention what these white dots are, and they are in fact water dots. Yes. No, they are not.
Okay. That was exactly the answer to the question. So thank you.
Yes. And so I want that stuff to happen. I don't think I want you to pull a lever and this starts draining.
Gotcha.
Although, I mean, do we do that? Maybe.
Okay.
Like the problem is just like, okay. Normally, if something is in water, you can't move it, right? And so you wouldn't normally be able to move stuff. But let me go back to this level that we were on. Oh, it's called KC demo. There are some things that you can do in water. So for example, this door here is in the water, and I can open and close it, this energy field thing, by standing on this button.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
I don't think that we repropagate ocean flow through that if it's blocked by that, but we probably should. We certainly could start blocking something with that, I think. So like if I mess with this level where, like, say this block starts out on this, and then this is like, let's put it over here just to be clear. So that's going to be open at the start of the level, right? If I manipulate this, so I step off the button and close it. Oh, that didn't actually. All right. So that's not hooked up to rivers at all, but you could see that that should block the river the same way as dropping a stone in does. We just haven't needed to do that, I guess, yet on a level. So you could have a level where there's one of those at an upper level, like feeding a waterfall that turns on, right? And maybe we do that, or maybe we just don't build that level, right? Or here's a more annoying situation that we also don't totally handle right now. Let me move this guy over here. We have the bard who can charm monsters and other characters, and also crystals for some reason. So like, she can get this thing to go in the water, but she can also like steer it around once it's in the water. So she can, like, keep blocking this river and cause it to redivert and stuff. And so you can imagine one of these on an upper level that is keeping the water in, that she causes it to move out of the way, right? And so the question is, do we build that level?
What just happened? Did the stream crash or something?
Oh, people are complaining.
Okay. I think the stream just went down or something.
All right. Well, they're saying it's back. Okay.
Okay.
I've been having very minor internet outages here. And I don't know what to do about that. Except just to move, honestly.
There's a lot of reasons to do that besides the internet.
Yeah, we are making a local recording, so it'll be okay. You can watch any parts that you miss later on.
And so just to clarify one thing about that, so the rocks that are like the blocker rock that you've got charmed right now.
Yeah.
So based on the way that it's rendered right now, my guess would have been that it wouldn't actually stop water from flowing at all. It would just stop water from flowing like violently, because it looks like it's kind of submerged in the water. So does that mean there's kind of two ways of blocking water in a sense as well? There's a blocking a river, quote unquote, which is a gameplay element. And then there's blocking water, which would change whether there was water there or not. Is that a fair statement?
The property of this rock right now is that you can step on it, but there is still water in the square, technically, right? But water can't flow through it. Like, there's water in the square, but like, it doesn't do anything, right? But if you move the thing, there's still water, right?
Yeah. By the way, your stream is now no graphics for some reason. I have no idea why.
Yeah, because while you were speaking, I was deciding to use that moment to start changing the windows around.
Okay.
And then that was a disaster.
We can pause for a second if you want to try and get it back.
Well, no, I just do this. Well, okay, let's just pause and do So what I was trying to do was make a window capture of like you in Discord, but I just get a black screen from window capture on Discord.
That's high quality.
Not even, yeah. So like, I don't, and of course there's two Discord windows. It says at C Muratori, then I put it up and there's like nothing. I'm trying, man. I'm trying my best here
It's not
to do a
possible
good
to get
stream
high
for the people.
quality.
Yeah. So the problem is the only way that I have to get you is like display. I like I want to have you up over the game while I'm doing the game, but I can only get you on display
So
capture.
just for the record, like the obvious thing that you want is you just want Discord to have a sources button that allows you to connect over the network to someone else's OBS, right? I
Oh,
mean,
now you're just asking for way too many.
so
I
we
mean,
should just go add that. I mean, granted, I'm sure like it would take 7 years just to be able to like build or something because there's probably like, 17 million libraries and 27,000 lines of code, but 27 million lines of code. But that would be a nice thing to add. Anyway,
okay. Back on
continue.
topic. To not allow these people to ruin our day. Um, okay, so those are things that we actually have some latitude in deciding how high powered we want to make this in terms of like, is it volumetric in some way? And for the purposes of what we're talking about today, I would be satisfied if it's like fakely volumetric. Like I think if you're rendering water, you want some interesting stuff to happen. So for example, people may not be able to see this very well. I'll actually turn off my camera again for a second because whoops, that's the wrong thing. There's so many things. So in the upper right, for example, you can see that there's sort of a very milk toast displacement map that's happening on the water. Like if you look up there, you can sort of see
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of specular reflection off it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not turned up right now. It doesn't look very good right now. It's one of those things that used to look a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, one very obvious way of making this water more 3D is to at least have like normal maps that are flowing with all this stuff, which actually is happening. It's just the lighting is not tuned,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you actually want it like if you really want it to feel like water,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't just want it like little normal maps. You want to do like displacement map at least,
Mm-hmm.
or possibly geometry, like scrolling by.
Mm-hmm.
You want, so if I do like so there's a subtle issue here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is you want your game to feel good,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily in an exploitative way, right? So like
Okay.
I'm not one of these Zynga people who is like, I want to reward you all the time. In fact, a lot of people complain about my games because I don't reward them all the time.
Like what?
Um,
Just hear me out for a second. What if when you push the rock into the water, all these coins came spewing out?
yeah, they could make the Mario coins sound when you
Yeah.
picked them up too. That would be great. Um, but so, but there is a thing about if something actually has gameplay circumstance consequence and is important, then there is a dimension to a game about that thing feeling good or not,
Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But part of that feeling good is, let me put it this way: things that are important in gameplay state should have proportionate impact visually and auditorily,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if something is important to gameplay, but it doesn't have as much impact, like say visually, but let's say you spent a lot of effort, like um I don't even know. I'm trying to pick something that doesn't have gameplay consequence. Like let's just say you took this gray grid that I'm standing on and put a lot of effort into making that look really nice.
Mm-hmm.
But then you drop the rock into the water and it like looks like it does now, which isn't as bad as it used to. Like it used to just be grid plunk plunk plunk. You can still see that happening
Mm-hmm.
underneath the particles. They're kind
Mm-hmm.
of hiding. But
Mm-hmm.
like if that's what it is, but like it looks like the Unreal micro polygon demo on the ground that I'm on right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's a fundamental mismatch. You don't
Yeah.
really want that, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So in cinema, that's called Hitchcock's rule. And basically it says that the importance of something to the scene should roughly correspond to the amount of attention it gets in the frame. And
Yes, this is of course named after Robin Hitchcock from The Cure. The,
absolutely
the guy,
not
guy with,
no relation to Alfred Hitchcock. And
yes.
so, I mean, basically, the paraphrasing of what you said, I think, is something's audio-visual presence in the game should roughly correspond to its importance in the gameplay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and that doesn't have to be exact,
Yeah. Rules
but
are never really rules, but they're just like rules of thumb.
you feel it when that's not the
Yeah.
case, right? Player feels it when that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
What also leads
And
players to
so,
create their own games sometimes, where they'll like end up spending a ton of time with something that is not the game at all because you made that more fun than the actual game, right? And more interesting and engaging. But
yeah. And so what I imagine is, for example, let's say if I were to do a very straightforward thing, starting here and just extrapolating forward, if I wasn't allowed to change the core technology that we are using at all,
mm-hmm.
right? Um, I will speak in a bit about maybe why we need more technology, or there's some things about the underlying thesis so far of, for example, using a fluid simulator underneath to help generate some of this stuff that
Mm-hmm.
either don't work or that we need to add more in order to make them work.
Mm-hmm.
But that's maybe getting a little ahead of myself. I would say, like, if I was to just take this forward,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
What I would do, and what I sent in these emails originally, right, is like, okay, for all these little white dots that we're drawing, these are actually, so what you see in front of you right now is actually really stupid. It uses a tremendous amount more fill rate than you see, mostly doing nothing, because these white particles are like my debug particles. If I go to the water particle render.gl, I can actually show you how big these circles actually are. They're like huge,
Oh my lord.
and they're overlapping. And the reason is that these are supposed to be, for example, like normal mapped wavelets
Mm-hmm.
that constructively and destructively interfere as they flow around.
Right. Yep.
And either you do a displacement map. So it's ironic that I say that nobody ever does deferred rendering, but like maybe you just add those into a height map scaler into a buffer and then do the normal map and lighting computation in a post pass, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I think actually you don't need to do that, because like supposedly you can't really add normals or gradients, but you actually can add bivectors. And like um I think if you do something slightly correct in linear algebra, aka geometric algebra, it comes out correct that you could just evaluate normals and add normals. But I haven't sat down to figure out what that is. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
you have all these wavelets like flowing around and constructively and destructively interfering, and that gives you something that is more water-like than what you already see. And I think I could get that going in like less than a day, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
like we actually used to have procedurally generated like little waves, like they were just like sort of like a sync pulse or whatever
Mm-hmm.
on each of these. It was just they were a little too regular, and a little too scaled a little too regularly. Like you want big waves and medium waves and small waves because you want something noise like to happen when they mix.
Mm-hmm.
But also when you do that, you don't want it to be too noisy because you want to be able to see the flow going in a specific direction,
Mm-hmm.
right? And all these things. Anyway, so step one is do that. Step two, add that into the Z offset of the ocean plane so that it maybe does some stuff like occludes um, at least the edges of some of these little islands that you see here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, that would also have a color component. So right now we have this very bland background color, but you actually can set a bitmap that will color the whole scene, right? So just your standard diffuse color thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then we have a few mechanisms that are disabled right now. So both maybe a background bitmap or else vertex painted stuff so that you don't require people to have a bitmap. They have a little vertex paint tool in the editor, and you could go paint like, well, maybe the waves are bigger over here and smaller over here, right? That could be one of the channels. Or
Although that seems a little bit not great because I mean, it sort of goes a little bit against the grain of what's supposed to be going on, which is to say that it's creating detail in the graphics where the detail doesn't actually exist in the gameplay. Like, it seems like someone should have to go put like some actual stuff over there to change what it looks like
I
a little.
mean,
You know what I'm saying to you?
sort of, but also no, because the problem is you don't want to, like, this is a kind of decision that has to be made correctly for any game, right?
Okay.
And if you add a lot of stuff, I mean, maybe we could figure out the way to make that work. But the problem with adding stuff is that people are always then confused of, is the stuff relevant to gameplay, right? Like, do I need to get over there or something? And if we had to do that on every level to make the level look good, that starts to be a problem of its own. And so, let me turn this back down. I'll make them medium-sized dots. Um, so like, I would at least like the ability to provide a good amount of visual visual interest on across a wide variety of levels, across hundreds of levels,
Mm-hmm.
without needing to do that. Maybe that's a wrong assumption, and we can talk about that. Or maybe other forms of visual interest, like background bitmap plus, uh, you know, just meshes on the ground under the water and controlling the overall opacity of the water and things like, maybe that's enough visual interest. It's hard to say,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I feel like this would be a good point. I kind of want another drink, so why don't we do the thing? Let's get questions from people. Do you want to do the question curator thing for a few minutes,
I mean, I
or
guess we could, but we haven't
want to
really
just
talked about
for
this
you?
yet, so.
Like, I kind of feel like the next thing to talk about is to uh, I have a few more things to say about the fluid sim. Um, Let me pause for a second and start some tea, and then we can talk about the fluid sim, and then maybe you can just start throwing questions at me or whatever.
Okay.
All right, so back in a minute. Why don't you just chat with the
Well,
people?
I'm going to go get some tea too.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Well, people out there can chat with the people, and we'll be back in a minute. Water is not boiled yet, but it's getting there. Okay. Is Casey back?
Yes, I am, actually.
All right, great. So here's what I thought of to say about this issue. So whereas the visuals of things, the Robin Hitchcock rule that we discussed is true,
Mm-hmm.
it is not. It does not completely determine things, right?
Yes.
And so there are aesthetic dimensions to whatever you're talking about that are essentially extra
Mm-hmm.
or that give you freedom to make other decisions, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, for example, in a game like this, I probably want the visuals of an island that I'm standing on to be very distinct from the water so that I don't have to squint and say, where's island and where's water,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if I make the island like brown or like a volcanic color or, green grassy color or whatever, doesn't necessarily matter. That's a degree of freedom that I have,
Mm-hmm.
right? When I'm deciding what the level looks like. And um, I mean, that's obvious so far, I suppose. Um, and so I would say that the goal actually, here, let me get, I got to get the cup for my tea. Sorry. Back in one more second.
Are we gonna get the awesome like swirling chai thing? One of my favorite parts of John's streams is when you do the swirling chai, like, and there's the
Does
rock
not help
music
my
playing.
tea if you do not have a cup for it. I mean, you could pour it straight in, but
Are we
you
gonna,
might.
John? Are we gonna get the swirling chai rock, like hard rock
We
thing,
have
or?
no milk right now.
Oh,
I almost went out and got some,
all
but we
right.
don't have it. But
Okay.
that might be a bonus stream tonight. Who
Okay.
knows? Okay, so I would say that part of the goal is to, when we're building a water system,
Mm-hmm.
right, is that we want to be aware that that presents certain dimensions of aesthetic explorability that are a little bit extra, like the color of an island or, the style of whatever the grass is or whatever all these things are, right?
Mm-hmm.
We want to both create something that provides ample ability or ample opportunities for that kind of elaboration,
Mm-hmm.
and also that something that technically lets us do those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the fluid sim, for example, well, okay, so we can drive particles. The direction about where they go could come from the fluid sim, or
Mm-hmm.
it could come from somewhere else, right?
Mm-hmm.
On particular levels,
Mm-hmm.
like if there's a level where there aren't any rivers and the
Mm-hmm.
flow is not going to change, you could have a statically painted flow map or an
Mm-hmm.
algorithmically painted flow map
Mm-hmm.
or something, and that gives you opportunity to do certain kinds of things. So you
Mm-hmm.
could imagine like a lone island in the middle of the water where the waves kind of like radiate around it in
Mm-hmm.
sort of like a Zen garden kind of a feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could imagine just waves constantly coming from southeast to northwest. Like maybe the fiction of a series of levels is that you're trying to get to the southeast, like into the wind. I don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whatever these opportunities are,
Mm-hmm.
we want to be able to play around with whatever those dimensions are. And so the wave height thing was one example of that. However, I will say that it often looks weird. Right, if you just start
What
playing
awesome
around,
looks weird?
or sorry, I meant wave size, like painting wave size around different parts of the map,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
Like if you paint that in a way where you're kind of being responsive to what the islands are, like if you're just saying I'm sort of painting it where waves are big when you're a certain distance from the islands, right? Then that could look more natural. But if you do it in a way that doesn't correlate, then it looks weird, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then the question is, well, should we auto-generate wave size, or do we prefer sort of having the freedom, or do you want something in between where you generate it but let people modify it?
Okay.
You know. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so the last thing I want to say, right? So we can control particles from fluid sim. We can control them from a statically painted thing. We could maybe have a crossfade between those things.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea behind a fluid sim to begin with is that like it automatically generates complexity for you to some degree that responds to the things in the level,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you can sort of see like this brown island on the north. I I put that there with the river flowing in, so you can sort of see that like there's this gameplay flow causing the
Mm-hmm.
particles to go in, and then they sort of like flow around to the left and go out, and
Mm-hmm.
they bunch up in these little pools.
Yep.
And that's all caused by the simulator. Like nobody had to hand paint that, right? And that's good
Yes.
to the extent that it produces behavior that you like.
Yep.
Here it's a little bit weird looking if you like sit down and think about it, because you're like, wait, shouldn't the sum of flow into one side be equal to the flow out the other side? And the reason it's not is because uh, for purposes of gameplay clarity, we cheat particle velocities when they're inside gameplay flow. So like
Mm-hmm.
the fluid simulator, like in this 2x3 or 2x4 grid that's kind of going into the little bay there or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
What's it called when it's like not a bay, but it's connected on both sides?
I have no
A
idea.
channel. It's a channel that's kind of got bays on each side.
Okay.
Um, so uh, the actual fluid sim has a much lower velocity for the particles going in, but we're amplifying it for gameplay clarity, because one thing that happens if you don't do that is there doesn't seem to be that big of a difference between river and non-river, because one of the things that a fluid sim is going to do is it smooths out the velocity field,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
so even if you color river differently from non-river, then the actual visible difference between what you see in the river and what you see outside the river
Mm-hmm.
is not going to be very large by default. If you just
Mm-hmm.
say there's river here and you let the fluid sim solve the rest,
Mm-hmm.
and that's actually bad, probably, right? Because then if the idea like, why is that lily pad not flowing, but if I push it one square over, it does flow? The particles are going just as fast in each place,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Approximately. And so that's like mentally very weird all of a sudden, and that's a problem that I would like to solve. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you think about it, like what's a fluid sim going to do if you just say all the water is still, and then you have a flowing river right here? It's going to make the stuff right next to it almost flowing river, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of violates the extreme discreteness of our gameplay world. So
Yep.
it's a little bit of a contradiction in what we're asking for,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And now sometimes that means you shouldn't ask for that, but sometimes it means there's an opportunity to find something that's still systemic and complex, but that gives you what you want. And so one example, like I said before, maybe we shouldn't have a fluid sim. That's one way to do it. Or maybe we need more on top of the fluid sim. So if you imagined like what would it take actually to have a strongly flowing river like this, um, with the water next to it kind of being still, you would need some kind of counter pressure, right? And so like and
Yeah.
counter like,
I mean, you can't really is the answer.
well, I mean, I haven't experimented with it. I mean, obviously, if you have counter pressure, it's like coming from somewhere, right?
I
But
meant you can't in nature. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, in nature, you just couldn't have this line of water
Right. Right.
flowing
Yeah.
like this
Yeah.
with stuff around it not flowing. That's just not a thing,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so the question is, are there things that we could feed in
Mm-hmm.
that would make something more like that? And maybe we could make it so that, next to any river like this, there's squares of water that are like flowing into it instead of out of it, or that are twisting into it, right? Even if the net flow in the square isn't that
Mm-hmm.
big.
Yep.
And that might actually be visually very interesting,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it might help with this problem. And then we cheat to bridge the rest of the way,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's one thing,
Okay.
right? Um, Another thing, though, this is all very obviously 2D right now, right? Um, the particles, the circular particles that I have right here. Okay, and let me just say, I don't think we should want or need to do like a 3D fluid sim if we stay with fluid sim. I think we can get by with like,
Yeah.
some 2D
I
fluid sims
I agree with you.
pasted together.
Uh huh.
Like it's so massively more computationally expensive to
Oh
do
yeah.
3D that we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But one very easy thing that we can do is we can have some inside the water particles, right, that fill out sort of fill out the square so that this river kind of area doesn't just feel painted on top, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it has some depth, and that could be done with the current system, like current technology. But I mean, it's just to say that like whether the fluid sim is the right thing is in question. Like it does these things that are good, and it also does some things that are bad. And the things that are bad are actually worse than the things that are good,
Mm-hmm.
because the things that are bad interfere with gameplay clarity,
Mm-hmm.
and even not even necessarily clarity, because I could just like pump up the brightness
Mm-hmm.
on the actual river areas and
Yep.
and say, look, it's very clear, but like uh you also want to sell it. Like you want your brain to accept what it's seeing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that lily pad really should be in an area with not that much net flow. Like maybe you could imagine that it's maybe got a string connecting it to a little lily
Yep.
stem connecting it somewhere, and it won't really move in a small current,
Yep.
but it will in a bigger current, something like that. Like
Yep.
we can do all these little things put together to like sell what's happening. But of course, we have to decide what that is. And then the last thing I would say is there's a question, what am I talking about? I can talk for days about this, but there's a question, when I push this stone into the water, right now we make these very 2D particles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason that's so big is to cover up the fact that we're changing a square at a time in terms of the coloration there,
Uh huh.
which is something that we would fix the underlying thing
Yes.
happening.
Yep.
But also, you probably just don't want a bunch of 2D particles, right? Like if you're doing sexy video game water for the year 2022
Uh huh.
or 2023, we're not announced. I don't know when the game's coming out. 2021, January -3rd, 2021.
Yep.
No, that is not. Uh, you would actually want probably to see some, like, how does this feel good, right? Well, there's good sounds, but there's good visuals. You see like the wave front has like
Yep.
some very active, energetic water that's plowing forward,
Mm-hmm.
making the changes that you made,
Yep. Yep.
right? And then so this rectangle that's next to where I'm standing right now, that's actually a little bit of a mistake, but there is some entity work going underneath. It doesn't get rendered correctly quite yet, but there's little turbulences that get drawn. So like when the water stops at this rock, there should be one here on the oh, there is. You just can't see it. See how like my feet are kind of cyan colored.
Uh-huh.
There's this little turbulence rectangle here
Yep.
on the rock, and then there's one here on the ground. And the idea would be we would draw those into the depth buffer, or maybe some geometry to be like, oh, there's water hitting these points and splashing back, right? So it would be more dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Like it wouldn't just be water smoothly flowing around a corner. It would be like water's hitting this corner and kind of getting like violently knocked back, or mildly violently knocked back.
Uh-huh.
So there's been a little bit of work in that direction, but as you can see, it's like not hooked up. That's probably enough of me just saying stuff.
Okay. I mean, I think I have everything now.
Yeah. So I have to now get you back on display capture. Okay. So, what is your opinion about what should be done?
So let me first ask a couple questions about what you were trying to do so far. So, if I understand you correctly, sort of the original concept here was you were going to have, I believe they call these methods wave packet methods, right? Where you're basically like sending little wave tracers around that, rather than being rendered as particles or level sets, they're rendered as little like wave functions that are trying to like have a phase that roughly gets set relative to something. That was sort of the original basic design of what you've got on the screen right now. You just haven't actually done that yet. That's why it's still just part of like circles and not an actual thing.
Yeah, basically, right? What I'm imagining is that each one of those particles probably has a color component that acts in the way that you would expect, that like blends with the other ones, but then also probably has a geometric component.
Yeah, okay.
And maybe you're adding that. Now, the thing about that is that's already kind of 2D. Like if you imagine that you were like tessellating things down to an extreme level, maybe you would just want the tessellator to make triangles there or something. And maybe that's better somehow.
Okay.
But that's the basic idea. And we've had we've had color in the past, and we've had like normal maps in the past, but we haven't had both. And then with the normal maps, they've always been weird. They like were added weird. You know, and then the other question is, how much motion do you get? Like if they're just like, if you imagine like a sync pulse that doesn't move, right? And that's just going through, you might need so many particles to do that it's totally unreasonable for that to look good. But if you like oscillate the sync pulse up and down, so it's like actually a standing wave that's animated, like a lot of simpler wave systems do, then you probably don't need nearly as many, because you get a lot of motion out of that. And that's actually what waves do in nature, I think, right? Is they're sort of moving, and this body of water has momentum to go up, and then it's falling, right? And so you would sort of be simulating that to get, I think, to drive us a little bit onto the topic of like, what are you actually simulating, right? And so the idea here is that, I mean, the idea here is at some level, every particle is simulating a piece of water in some way, like not at as high of a resolution as you would need to do like anything like serious simulation, but to get visuals out of it. And that's actually a stark difference. So like way back in the day, a couple years ago or whatever, I made a system that was much simpler, but it looked better again, right? But was limited. And what that was, you know, we know the gameplay flow direction at all these grid points. And so we'll tessellate each square into like 4 points, and then we'll do like a blend of, you know, normal maps. Like every pixel had like 4 normal maps blended together, and from the neighbors, right? And the normal from the neighbor was like the flow in whatever direction that was, right? And so that was a very relatively straightforward, simple gridded way of getting some kind of nice, you know, water flow that was controllable. Is just very gridded and very not organic. And it doesn't give you anywhere to go once you've done that. It's like, okay, great. Now I've got some grids and I've got some water, and it's not as nice as I would like.
Okay.
And so this was our attempt at like, okay, how do you do something different? Okay, instead of instead of generating your normal maps or whatever, your waves from these fixed grid points going in fixed directions, we'll do it just by having particles moving freely like
Yep.
a bird through the world.
Okay, so I think I've got it all. So now I will say what I think off the top of my head with some caveats. So there's a couple important caveats. One is that so continuum dynamics is not my thing. I mean, we'll start with that, obviously. I don't do this for a living, even a little bit. So, you know, my thinking on this topic is not going to be particularly good. And the second thing is that, you know, most of the time when I work on a problem like this, I do probably have a pretty good idea when I start that's not terrible, but after I actually sit down and really work the problem for 6 months, I'm at a completely different place. So I'm just guessing that whatever I say now is also not what I would end up with if I actually went. So, you know, it's the place I would start, right?
Totally. I understand that completely.
Okay.
Having done it many times myself.
Yeah. So my high level thinking on this is that I guess I disagree with the second part of what you just said, which was that you had a system where you took a grid and you did the 4 like normal map blending thing, and you were like, but I don't know where to go from there, so you switched to the particle one. I guess I think maybe that first system sounds more like the right system to me, and let me go through why I think that. So from looking at the problem the way you've described it, I feel like the way that I would think of it is, this is a game that wants the water to be what the water is going to be at each square. And the reason I say that is because everything else in the game is about what's on that square. So much like you said, if the lily pad is staying still, the last thing I want is the water sim to come in here and draw some particles clearly moving past that lily pad, because that just feels weird, and it makes the player not really understand what the heck is going on, because they look at the thing and they go, oh, so I guess the water is not really a thing. I'm just supposed to look at like the color of the water, because that's the thing that actually tells me, and the motion of the water is irrelevant because I can't trust it or something, right? And so I feel like if you go too far down that route, you're always going to be fighting this sort of like cognitive dissonance between what the water looks like it's doing, and you're always going to have to paper over the fact that it's not doing the right thing. So for me, the first thing I clue in on there is I want the water to say what it's doing on each square, and I want to start there. That's just what my head wants to start with now, right? So that's like my first thought is I want to start with the gameplay, and if it says this water isn't moving, then that's an important underlying input to the system that I should be working with, not papering over. So that's thought one. Thought two is I want to split the way that I'm simulating this into 2 parts. So one part is creating attractive and interesting water from that input. So that's one thing that I want to be able to do. And I think I have a pretty good idea how I do that, so we'll talk about that in a second. But the second part of that is I probably want to tackle the transition of water properties in a slightly separate way. And the reason I say that is because in this game, you're not going to have most of the water undergoing large-scale transitions most of the time. So designing a system that can do really good effects for I pushed a rock in front of the waterfall as the way all of the water is being simulated is probably going to suck down a lot more GPU time and potentially CPU time than I'm going to want. So in my thinking, I'm imagining that I will always want to do a pre-pass where I build rectangular regions, maybe even sometimes not exactly rectangular regions. So let's just say disjoint set forest. So some set of n collections of contiguous squares that are currently undergoing water transformation. And I think I would partition my simulation into 2 parts, one that handles those isolated square regions and one that handles everything else.
Okay.
So those are my 2 structural thoughts. Let's start by ignoring the transition regions first, because I think that's sort of a separate simulation problem, and then, well, also it's the thing that's doing the least amount of water at any given time. So the first question I have is, have you seen, let me bring it up here. Have you ever seen Water Surface Wavelets, the paper, by the NVIDIA paper?
Not sure.
Do you want to take a quick look at the video for Water Surface Wavelets and take a look at specifically the part where they show how to paint water stuff into it?
This actually might be, it says SIGGRAPH 2018. So this could well be after I was doing the research to do the thing. Because when I did the 4-way grid thing that I did, it was like sort of based on, you know, what some people, some paper somewhere.
Yeah.
Right?
So jump forward to the part, well, you can watch the whole thing if you want, but the part that I'm specifically interested in is the part where they show how to paint water velocity.
I can't really read the text. Oh, wave painting. Exactly.
You'll be able to see when you get there. Just keep running for, yeah. Here you go. So this is just, I want some waves, right? And then in a second they show, I want some directional flow.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, it's true that something like this, okay. Yeah. So if we have a fluid sim running in the background, right? Then, wow, I don't know if this is happening for the viewers, but the video is just super skippy for me. I think it's just.
It's happening for the viewers. Yeah. It's okay.
OBS plus.
Yeah. Too much to ask.
You guys can go watch this video.
Yeah.
Correct. Like, it's literally rendering frames from back in time and then forward. Like, it's not just.
Yeah, it's whenever those happen to show up at OBS, like, it's like that's the order you get them in.
No, but I mean on the screen for me.
Yeah. No, I mean,
I'm watching this in the fantastic web browser that is the future of software distribution that all the kids like to tell me it's solved. Like, I'm seeing frames out of order in the browser. Like, it's crazy. Okay. So something like this, actually, something like you're seeing behind the boats in this scene, or like before when they were painting the waves and you had very still water, that probably is the best thing, honestly. And we're not really going to get that from the fluid sim. That said, right, one use that I could, so if we say that it's a fundamentally painted driver of the visuals, then we could still use a fluid sim for something like, well, here's a level that it's got islands with an interesting shape, and there's just no rivers on this level, so like flow doesn't really matter. And so then we can use that to do whatever, like, well, we want to seed the flow maybe with the fluid sim, and like then generate some paint vectors that then we sample and like output to a bitmap or something, you know.
Yeah, so
because honestly, it would be nice to not be running a fluid sim at runtime if we just use that as an authoring tool sometimes.
But just to be clear, that paper is a fluid sim.
Oh, okay.
So the way that paper works is, I would say, probably pretty close to the thing I would start with for your system if I was going to take a crack at it. And what it does is it runs a fluid sim on the coarse mesh. So kind of like the mesh you've got out in front of you might be the density of the fluid sim, like, right? You wouldn't actually have a more detailed one. Like, it looked like when you brought up that bitmap, you were doing a much more detailed fluid sim than the game grid. So this paper would do it more like on the grid that you see in front of you, which is exactly what I want, because I'm thinking I want to basically be able to specify some of these values directly, and then other ones I want to just take on whatever characteristics they are, and yet other ones, such as the ones like that are in areas that are gameplay important, I might want to always zero out and say, no real motion here, or almost no motion, right? Then what they do is in the tessellator on the GPU, they use the same basic idea as you get from, like, what do they call those things? I think I wrote it down here so I wouldn't forget when I was taking a quick look. So Tessendorf waves, they call them a lot, but they're basically like when they do this, they did the spectral analysis of what you tend to get in water and what the breakdown of the waveforms are, so that when you just want, like, when VFX people just want an ocean, they just like put in these parameters and you can sample it without doing any fluid sim. It's just like, it just gives you an ocean because they know what the general waveform should be. You know what I mean?
Kinda. I've never seen that, but I will definitely do some reading there.
Yeah, so there's a whole field of fluid dynamics literature you can go read, which is literally just like, we want effectively closed form solutions to oceans and lakes and stuff, where we just sample known waveforms. And the reason you don't just use these always, obviously, is because they don't respond to anything, right? They don't right. respond to boundaries. They don't respond to the shape of the water. They just give you back thing that looks like water for a given patch and nothing else, right? So what the NVIDIA people did is they basically are doing sort of that in a way that is interpolated through the water sim. So they have the simulation vectors, and then they like basically upsample that using what they know to be believable waveform patterns for water, right?
Right.
So that to me sounds like a really good first step for your water thing, and here's why. Number one, it gives you a really good way to control the system, because you can use some water sim if you want to by allowing the actual grid to undergo a solve, or you can just not. You can always just set those values. That's what the painting example sort of gives you, is more of a thing where you're like, look, I can just override what that thing is telling me, because I'm going to mostly want for all of the places near where the player can go to just frickin' specify this is what it is. So that feels like a really good start. And second, because it's using a wave distribution function for the upsampling, that also suggests to me that if you had, like, I'm imagining if I sat down and started to play with this, I would gain some intuition for how those equations were working and how I wanted to structure them. And I could probably imagine giving artists control over those wave functions in ways that would allow them to shape the characteristics of the waves to be more appropriate to this particular game, as opposed to, I want it to look like real water, because this game doesn't look like real anything. It's like a fantasy, world that has a certain art style to it. And you probably want your waves to be correspondingly not like the real world. And so I feel like being able to shape those wave functions is probably something that could easily be done, because they're by definition being done as a interpolation pass that doesn't actually affect the simulation, and therefore won't like make everything explode if the artist like does weird things to the parameters. So that's my first thought. And I think what I would do is I would start there. If it were just me and I was starting for nothing, I'd be like, let's start there. Let's see what we can do with interpolated, well-distributed wave summations in the tessellator based on an underlying grid that we can paint and or run the sim on lightly if we decide we need that for some reason.
So, when we have a very crisp gameplay grid like this, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that that's a job that has to be done, an aesthetic job that has to be done, regardless of the implementation method so far, mm-hmm. because nothing has magically solved this. Mm-hmm. Is you always want to get corners to like look good, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. So in my very original, like even before the 4-way blend, I had like just scroll a normal map in one square and whatever, and then you see the thing going down and then going to the right. And you kind of just want to round it, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. and make it look nice. Mm-hmm. And then the 4-way blend one, I forget what it looked like, but like it didn't look great. And actually in a lot of cases of corners or intersecting in different ways, naive blends like that will often they'll kind of die. Like the blend will not be of the right magnitude exactly, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. because you're adding a different number of things or whatever. Or if you imagine a 3-way intersection, actually I don't remember what the problems were. Anyway, there were problems. Like mm-hmm. it didn't look that great. And then the fluid sim version, of course, you kind of get for, I don't even know what the fluid shape would be right now if I turned these particles into,
Yeah.
uh, but you can already sort of see like they're not even like evenly distributed across the river. Like particles tend to clump into the near side
Yep.
of
Yep.
some of this
Hmm.
flow. And so you need to maybe start addressing that if you're even going to get a uniform shape.
Yeah.
And maybe you could get it looking good eventually, but there are problems that have to happen. So I'm wondering, like, so one way to control that completely, right? Imagine I was generating a per pixel flow direction image that's at the same resolution as the screen, and then
Uh huh.
that's being used by whatever backend, right?
Uh huh.
So an obvious thing that I can do is just have curved tile pieces that I like slap down for the corners or whatever, that are just like the shape that I want, right?
Hmm.
And you could add a noise function to that, or you could animate them, or something.
Hmm.
But that's very controllable,
Hmm.
right? And so question one is like, maybe that's the right way to go. And then maybe I don't really want a sim. I guess the thing I don't know from this paper is if I don't want to do a sim, which I'm not necessarily sure I do. Like I could think of things that I want to sim, like, hey, if I want this wavefront smashing forward, maybe there's just like some little spheres bound to each other with springs or whatever, and I'm running that, and that's not even really a water sim, but it's just giving me something for the front of it that
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
is extra, right?
Yeah.
Um, so
Well, I mean, just to be clear, like that's one of the reasons why I thought of this paper particularly is because it's partitioned into two halves, and you can
yeah,
assess each half separately. If you don't want
but
to,
then
if you don't want to
so
do a sim, you don't. Then you just don't do one, right?
the actual rendering part, if I'm not going to do a sim,
Mm-hmm.
like what does the actual rendering part do? So it's sampling. It's got some distributions of some frequency distributions that it knows how to
Yeah.
generate waves, and it
Yeah.
just does it interpolate those parameters based on surrounding grid squares, and then like
Yeah, I mean, I believe basically
evaluates the wave.
the idea behind the paper is that you have some set of parameters that you have computed either with a fluid sim or just you specified what you wanted. And then the majority of the paper's contribution is let's make a tessellator that produces believable water from that very low res input, which I think is exactly what you want, basically, right?
Well, I'm not sure about the tessellator part. Like if it's an NVIDIA paper, they're about using GPU features in ways that I don't
Well, yeah,
necessarily care
you don't
about.
necessarily care about test layer. They're just
Yeah.
doing that because they want the water to actually displace, which you usually do. But I mean, maybe you don't in this case for some reason. But usually, you want your water to have a varying height.
I mean, I might. Like I'm agnostic about that to a
Okay, but yeah,
degree.
you could replace tessellator with pixel shader if you would rather, right? If that's your
Yeah.
call, it doesn't matter which one.
I mean, or it could just be pre-tessellated to some degree. Like I don't know to what degree they need to dynamically allocate triangle density, or if I could start with like a uniform grid and just like move those up and down and then make up the difference with normal math.
Well, it's a sampleable function, so you do anything you want, right? If you want to, you can make it sample to tessellate. If you'd rather, you can have it sample to produce pixels. You could subdivide, sure. If you look at the two samples and decide that there's too much variance between them, you can subdivide. I mean, it's just sampleable functions, so whatever you want to do with it, you could do. Obviously, I haven't implemented the paper myself because, like I said, I don't work with this stuff, but
Yeah.
it seems like the right place to start because it does what you want, right? It takes a low res mesh and upsamples it into stuff that looks like water, which seems like a good place to start, and to see what you can get out of that. And the other reason I say that is because since it is fundamentally a low res grid super sampling approach, to me that also suggests that I could go in there, and I mean I don't know if I could or not because I haven't actually looked at it, but that suggests to me I could probably go in there and, for lack of a better term, make the interpolation worse. And the reason that I say that is because if the goal of this game is to make things look square-y, then one thing I might want to do is change probably what they're going to do is something like a radial basis kind of approach where they're going to get really nice smooth continuity because they're trying to make it look like water. Maybe I want to make it look blockier with a harder fall off. So maybe I go in there and change it to a fairly tight smooth step around the cube,
Well,
and things like
during parts
this.
of the video where they were that first painting part where they showed like that, seemed crisp enough.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows?
Yeah, I
Who
agree.
knows? But like,
But I don't know. But I felt like that'd be another thing I could screw with to give the water an almost unnatural look, but one that reinforced the gameplay in a way that might be cool. And, maybe it might not be, but it's something I could try. Which, again, usually what I'm looking for when I look at something like this, and I have a very specific problem statement like you had, I'm just like, how many options does this approach give me? Because if the answer is I just got to do this one thing and it comes out the way it comes out, that to me doesn't sound very profitable because I know that's probably not going to be exactly what I want. But this approach was like, okay, there's a lot of things I can screw with here. I've got a coarse grid and a super sampling step. The super sampling step is pretty arbitrary. I could blend it however I wanted to. I could adjust the way that it was doing. Like you said, maybe I don't want a tessellator. Maybe I just want to produce like coloration values or normal maps from it or whatever. I could probably do that because it's not coupled to the simulation, which I really like, because the more coupled it is to the simulation, the less flexibility I'm going to have to change it without potentially breaking everything and all this other crap. So I felt like I was like, yes, this feels good. When I was thinking about what you said and remembering that paper. So anyway.
Well, of course, the problem now with this discussion is to evaluate that paper requires like a substantial amount of engineering work that will not happen on this stream.
That's correct.
So I don't know where to take the discussion now because it's sort of like, well, try that.
Well, dynamic.
Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the end.
Dynamic sim is now the question. So there's a second part of your thing, which is like, I push rocks in the water or I move rocks out of the mouth of a thing.
Yeah.
So obviously that particular paper really doesn't help us at all there. I mean, maybe it helps us.
Doesn't it? I mean, they were showing it evaluate the thing while they were painting into it.
No, I just mean it doesn't help us because it assumes we already have like the surface of the water and all we're trying to do is like upsample it to look good. But in your case, we don't actually have that necessarily. So like, for example, the case I'm thinking of is when you had that sort of pool sitting up above the main level and it has this mouth where the water can flow out, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about the case where I've got maybe one of those yellow energy fields, and so it's completely blocked, and then I remove the energy field, and now I want to see the water come forward like in a sort of way that creates the resulting waterfall over time, right? I don't just want to see it appear like I want to see, right? Yeah. And so while the create and destroy river function, that part on the flat surfaces, that part I could see just hacking away at the NVIDIA method might produce okay results. I'm not sure it would, but it might. Because you could just like make really turbulent parameters at the head and tail or something, right? Yeah. But I'm not sure it will. And then for the waterfall case, I don't see how it helps at all, I guess is what I'm saying. So we still need some idea of how that's going to be tackled. And so what I was thinking for that is probably what I would say is I feel like that's probably more where your particles are going to want to come into play. So the way I would probably suggest tackling that, the way I would have started it, is I've got a notion both of where are the water tiles, which is what normally we're doing, and let's say we're simming them with something like the NVIDIA approach there. Sure. But then I've also got a notion of tiles that are becoming water. So in other words, they weren't water, and now because of a gameplay state change, when the gameplay system comes in and starts tagging things as newly water, I remember that I had not been rendering them as water previously. So that state change has happened in the game, but the renderer, much like your animation system, is like trying to play catch up. So too is this part of the water sim. This water sim has now been basically given a directive from the game, hey, quickly find a way to make this look like it has water, and you're like, okay. And so then what I would say is, from that, I would say we probably want to now have a particle flow, like kind of a mixed system, where I'm going to be shooting water particles from the water tile or tiles around it into it, and doing some sort of volumetric rendering there. Because, well, there's only two things I can think of to do. One is that one, and then you use a level set method to actually produce some water surfaces until it fills up. And the other one is I don't know if it would actually work or not, but it's like the only other option I can think of is you actually just write something procedural which takes the sides of water that are bordering the cells that are newly water, and you have a way of displacing them forwards in some procedural way that doesn't involve shooting particles out. And
So I'm not sure that. Okay. So in terms of what we're gonna do gameplay wise, like what are we going to allow ourselves to do in terms of level geometry, right?
yeah.
If you imagine, so we're talking about the case of, um, a yellow force field keeping water in, and then you open it up. What happens?
Yeah.
Um, what if there's just like dry land below there, and the water goes down and has to go somewhere, which kind of sounds like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think we're going to do that.
Okay. Then great.
I mean, and that solves most of the problem. Like you still have a problem of like you need water traveling along this vertical thing that somehow stylistically matches the rest of the water, but maybe that's not that hard.
In theory, you could probably get away with doing something pretty similar. Like, so with the NVIDIA method, their wave functions are going to be about upright water. But you could probably go ahead and hack those wave functions to just be like waterfall-esque water and just use those on that part of the water. Like, I bet I could make that work if, again, if I studied this for a while.
As a very first approximation, if you just like pretend it's just flowing sideways really fast.
Exactly.
Rotate it 90 degrees, right?
Exactly.
And then like, alter the higher frequencies so that they're biased downward or whatever. So it's like things are,
I mean,
things have weight.
It's not, it's going to be the kind of thing that like you'd have to start taking a look at, but I mean, fundamentally speaking, it doesn't seem like an impossibility, right? It's like, look, there's wave functions. We can probably hack some together that will produce a relatively believable waterfall. So we just apply the same frickin' technique to the water there as we do elsewhere. It just has a different wave function. It's coded. We know when we output these in the same way that we have the coarse mesh for everything else. We also have the coarse mesh for there, and they have specific values that say I'm a waterfall as opposed to I'm moving this direction, that direction, right?
Yeah, and then of course you can always add particles to taste as you need to cover things up. Okay, well, I mean, I guess that's what we're going to try. It sounds like it makes sense to me. I mean, of course, I might go read the paper and then say this is stupid.
Yep.
But, probably not.
And more important than the paper, I would assume, is just just going, look, it's more just, can we spend some time trying to do wave function mixing? Maybe the paper sucks, but that idea I think is okay. So maybe just the broad idea could be profitable, even if the paper isn't, Yeah.
Should we do questions from the viewing public now?
Sure.
Do you feel like that's a good time? Okay. Casey will moderate your questions. So type the questions. Make sure they're the best question that you've ever asked in your life.
All the best questions.
And Casey will decide. I will grab a snack while he's doing that, and I'll be back.
How's the progress on the fundamentals of programming beta, Casey? It's going. It's a pretty big project, so it's been tough to finish.
Just a couple more minutes and I will be ready. So, I don't usually have food at home, but way back at the start of quarantine time, I was like, oh, I need to get a lot of food. And then I was like, all right, well, I don't usually eat at home. So why don't I get a lot of fun food that I used to eat when I ate at home, like when I was a kid? So I got like a bunch of SpaghettiOs. I got like 8 cans of SpaghettiOs.
Yeah.
And at that time, I invested. This was a very important investment in a box of brown sugar cinnamon Pop-Tarts.
Oh.
Because that is serious quarantine food.
Gotcha.
And I feel that this investment has come to maturity, and it's time to liquidate the investment. And so I'm doing that now.
So John, oh, he left. By the way, Genos3, I cannot overlay John over his image because I don't have a feed from John's camera. His computer can't do it, unfortunately. Like his computer can't stream his webcam to me while also capturing his screen for Twitch.
Given how much trouble we've had so far, like if I try to add the virtual camera splitter on top of all this, yeah. Okay, one sec. I haven't ever done the separate streaming PC thing just because I don't want to have more computers.
Yeah.
That might just be what I have to do.
I actually highly recommend it, even though I absolutely hate computers. Just because this is one case where you can just like leave it set up and never touch it, no matter what you do to your dev machine, and that helps paper over the ridiculous crap. It's no easier to set up the first time because it's still complete crap, and the capture card will be complete crap, and all that stuff, but at least you just, like, as much as possible, leave it in stasis until Windows updates itself and ruins everything. Which happens about every 6 months.
Yep. Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess I would say, no offense to the chat, but not a real...
The questions are terrible.
Not a really bumper crop today. It's okay. We're going to go through them anyway. So I'll start with the first question, which I think has a pretty easy answer. So even though I don't think it's particularly relevant necessarily, it's probably a pretty easy answer. And that is, if there was way less time and budget, what sacrifices could be made to finish this requirement faster? And I have an answer, but I'll let you answer first.
It doesn't really work that way. Like, if there were less time and budget globally across the game, you want to use the Robin Hitchcock from The Cure rule, right? And allocate sufficient reasonable amounts of time to everything to bring them all up to a particular level, right? And so if you told me well, you only have a week to do water or something, I'd be like, well, that's going to put water out of phase with everything else. So let's take some time away from something else and put it on water. However, I have another level of answer to that, which is, you know, so Casey, you used to go to GDC, right?
Yeah, back when it didn't suck as much.
Yeah, I used to go to GDC also. And even back then, we thought it was pretty terrible. Um,
Not in so what I will say is 97, 98 ish, like right
yeah,
after it got taken over, but before they had time to turn it to crap.
yeah.
It was
It was all right.
kind of
It was all
amazing.
right.
Like, you know,
I still remember it was a long time ago, but I remember talking to Charles. It was probably like 2000 or 2001 or
mhm.
something. And he was like, I just went to see a movie in the middle of the day because the conference sucks.
Yep,
And I was like, yeah, I get you.
yep.
I know where you're coming from.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so back when we used to go to GDC, one thing you will learn from the wise people at GDC Lecturing Incorporated
Hmm.
is that you have to scope your game. All right. What you will learn from these people is that whatever brilliant, amazing ideas you have for a game at the outset, they will tell you over and over that you can't do all those things.
Hmm.
And that 2/3 of the way through development, you'll find that you have to dump half your game on the floor and then stitch the rest of it together
Hmm.
and rescue that and somehow ship that.
Hmm.
Right. Um, and then a lot of these games are like Metacritic 65 and don't even make any money when the reason you shipped them out the door was ostensibly to make money. And then a lot of these people, the company name on their badge, when they went to speak at GDC, that company doesn't exist anymore. All right.
Okay.
So, like,
Yep.
I'm just saying, question the advice a little bit. Right. And so, uh, since I started my new way of game design, right, which fortunately we're still able to do because people bought The Witness, right? I have never scoped a game where I'm making air quotes with my finger. Scoping a game means to cut it down from what you wanted to make to what you actually can make. Both Braid and The Witness went the other way. They both got bigger. Braid certainly, maybe not in terms of number of level. Like I didn't know how big it was going to be in terms of levels, but in terms of like feature set and how much time we spent making it look nice and all that, we did way more, right? And then with The Witness, it's just a massively bigger game. Like we thought it would be at most, um, you know, I figured it might be a 20-hour game because Braid was like a 5-hour game, and making a game 4 times as big would be huge. But it's like if you play everything in The Witness, it's easily 100-hour game unless you're like really fast at puzzles. Um, it's just huge. So the way I like to see it is, look, if you're going to put a lot of effort into something anyway, like it's not easy to make games, right? Even now with Unity Game Engine, where you press the Make Game button, if you do that, you just have the same thing everybody else has when they press the Make Game button, which isn't very good, right?
Hmm.
So it's hard. It's hard to get to a point where you're even able to release something that's notable in any way, right?
Hmm.
It takes you a decent amount of time and effort to get there. So why would you then waste the opportunity that you spent getting there by just like firing it off a little too early and having it not be that good, right? Because then it'll take you, I don't know, did it take you 2 years to get to that point? It's going to take you another 2 years before you can get to that point again and have another attempt at maybe being able to make something good. And so if your response every time is, I got to scope this because it's been 2 years or whatever, then, uh, well, I mean, the strategy you are undergoing has an obvious result, right? And we just see that over people's careers in the games industry, and like nobody stops to question that. That said, I'm notorious for taking a long time uh, doing game projects, and you don't have to take as long as we do, especially if you don't insist on building your own engine all the time and all these things. Although it does help with quality if you build your own engine. So like these are all decisions that you can make. I don't know. I feel like I've answered that question to a reasonable degree
Hmm.
at this point.
So next question is sort of a.
Well,
Oh, sorry.
Do you have anything to say about that?
I
About the whole scoping thing? And because I know you're working on your own thing that you've been working on for a long time, and I don't think you feel like scoping it, right?
so I guess
Or
what I would say is that I have mixed feelings about this. Here are my feelings about it. So I think scoping your life slash company is incredibly important, and scoping your game is completely unimportant. Is I guess the way I would say it. Because when I try to assess like what makes things I'm working on late, it's almost always that like I had too many other things to do. Does that make sense?
are you saying that work-life balance causes you to not get work done?
Um,
Or
no, more like work balance, right?
work
So
balance?
like,
Yeah,
it's really hard to do like Handmade Hero, for example, and also work on a hard technical problem because oftentimes like you need to be able to go for like a month of time where your brain is literally focused just on this one thing, right?
I agree. And I actually don't get to do that at all these days
And
because
it's
I'm doing a compiler and a
exactly.
engine and a game. And it does affect the quality of work, like no question.
Yes, and I think the problem is that so okay, so one thing I will say like from what you just talked about is I would say but you do kind of scope your game a little bit, right, John? Because you didn't pick the hardest possible technical game to do along with your compiler, right? And that was a smart decision because you could have
Well,
picked a more technically ambitious game, right? You easily could have if you'd wanted to. We could easily come up with games that would have been worse than this one. Now, granted,
yes.
as you normally do, you always go like, let me push what I can do in this game to the limit.
Yeah.
But you didn't go, let me also make the massively multiplayer online first person infinite view distance 1,000 people per server game, right? Which you could have done if you weren't trying to say, let me pick the easiest to scope of my ideas to go with my compiler.
Yes.
So
Well,
that was a smart decision, right?
I would like to use a different verb for that because I
Okay.
think of those as relatively orthogonal things.
Okay.
Like, yeah, you absolutely should be smart at the outset about what you're deciding to build.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, that's the canonical newbie mistake is like, kid gets out of school and wants to get in video games and wants to make the super MMO sports spaceship game or what, just like put everything in there. And it's like, well, actually, it's very difficult to do what you're talking about, right?
Hmm.
So that is universal, right? It's very hard to make games, and you need to respect that going in. Um, Even going back to Braid, though, when I did Braid, it was like, look, I have this history of not finishing projects. How do I help ensure that I finish this one? I'm going to do a 2D game
Yeah.
because I don't want to deal with 3D,
Yep.
right? That was like a foundational decision, and it paid off, right?
Yep.
Like that's just what that was. Um, so that is true. That is different, however, than like giving up on your dreams in the middle of development.
Yep.
Sort of. I mean, you could have a hybrid of those things where it's like, I guess I'm learning now what is practically able to be accomplished. And when I made this decision early on, I didn't really know. But the people who lecture for GDC Lecturing Incorporated LLC don't really have that excuse because they've made like 4 games before or whatever. They should know. And they still say, well, you have to scope your game every time. And I'm like, no, just make a better decision about what you're going to build, or work in a situation where you're not as budget constrained, right?
Yeah.
Which also has implications on what you can build, right? Like I cannot build Assassin's Creed Ragnarok or whatever because like I just don't have that kind of money,
Yeah.
right? I could build an indie version of an Assassin's Creed game with that kind of gameplay, but like I just can't build those huge maps full
Yeah.
of historically accurate things.
Yeah.
But because I don't try to do that, we have money to pay people to stay employed for extra years beyond, what we originally would have scheduled or whatever, which is why we don't have to like scope the game in the GDC lecture sense.
Yeah.
All right. Way too much on this point, I think.
Okay, next point. And I don't necessarily think the question quite gets at the answer that is actually useful, but I'll ask the question: what about refractions and seeing the seabed with some kind of caustics eye candy?
The answer is we already have a very cheap, basic version of that. Like if I zoom in here, I mean, maybe I'm too zoomed now. As you can sort of see, if you look at those two yellow blocks,
I think they're obscured at the moment.
Well, no, they're actually not, because they're over your face as well. The problem is the frame rate is really low. Okay, so if you look at these blocks.
Oh yeah, I see. Okay.
I've got to lock the camera and then Alt Tab. Oh, I locked it in the wrong place. Okay. So if you look real close, I mean, there's a lot of motion on the screen, but you'll see that the edges of these stones are not solid. They're actually wavy. They wave a little bit. And that's because we are doing some diffraction or refraction or whatever that you want to call it. It's not a great deal right now. But we already do that. Like the shader for the ocean decides, decides, it gets drawn after the background gets drawn, and it decides where to sample from that background, which is not a physically correct thing to do, but it is the general hack that video games often do to create the impression of that. And then, there are little geometric tricks you can try to do to get it sort of as close as you can to what it really is, right? But again, in this kind of a game, we can do that kind of a trick heavily. Whereas in a game like The Witness, we couldn't do that kind of a trick. We had to be physically accurate for reasons of gameplay, right? So it's actually kind of a relief to be able to do weird hacks and stuff. That said, right, if we wanted to do a higher powered version of that, like I'm sure there's a whole literature on just like how to do 5% better.
Oh yeah.
Water refraction, right? So that's not like, by the time you're at a point where you're like, look, I know what the height of the water is per pixel, and I have a scene in the background that I know what the depth buffer is and stuff, or I can do some pre-computed stuff just in 3D without pre-rasterization or whatever. Like, you can do a lot with that, and I'm not really worried about that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say to the question is just like, we're kind of talking more right now about how do we produce something that allows us to get information about what the water surface should be, and how we then choose to render that is actually a totally separate question that actually can be answered in a whole variety of ways that may be completely decoupled from how you figure out what the surface should roughly look like, if that makes sense. So, I mean, everything from on RTX cards, we run a ray tracer from the water surface to actually produce the exact thing, to some kind of random hack with screen space sampling is on the table. And, that's usually not that hard to decouple from the where the heck is the water surface, or what is its turbulence at a particular point, which is what we kind of needed to know here. All right, so question: what about making a prototype scene to set the stylistic direction? I have no idea what John wants the water to look like.
Okay, that is something that we do for most aspects of the game. However, okay, step one. Okay, when artists develop a style for a game, right? Partially they're working from ideas or like sketches or something, but partially what they are doing is figuring out how to use the tools that you give them in the engine, or in terms of what content generation tools you have or whatever, figuring out what they can do with those things that looks good and how to make things look good with those things, right? So if you're saying, well, just have them make a concept for water, it's like, well, they don't have tools for water because we haven't built the tools for water because we don't know what those are yet. And so if they make any concept for water, well, you can start doing that, but then it's not going to be constrained by the other. So like you can go into Max or Maya and like render a scene that has cool looking water, and that could help a little bit, but it's not guided by any of the stuff that we're talking about. And then at that point also is not guided by, is it real time or not? And is it so real time that you can throw it into your scene and not worry about frame rate, right? Or even, and there are other questions like, does it take a consistent amount of time, like whatever method is being used for this water, right? One thing we did do before was, one person who was working on this at that time likes Unreal Engine a lot and did a little bit of Unreal Engine prototyping, but like it never really looked like any, like, what water looks like in an Unreal Engine game, and it looked like that. And it was like, well, if we want that, we know how to do that. It just, that prototyping never got beyond that point. It's possible that we could have done that, but again, like part of our job in establishing the style of this game is to like you want to be a little bit new. You want to just like not copy everybody, right? If you can't figure out anything new to do, then that's fine. But we already should be able to figure out new things to do because we already have new inputs. Like, I don't think I've ever played a game that has these like grid-based orthogonal river flows where you disrupt rivers and stuff, right? And so that kind of leads you to at least a slightly different implementation than whatever everyone else has. Also, we're still in a situation where technology keeps improving over time. And so just the fact that you have better technology than the people 4 years ago who made whatever other, and by that, I mean the hardware technology, right? There's a lot more transistors going. The software technology is actually worse, but we kind of suffer through that. So all these things mean you should be able to do something new or different or good. And so then if you use like an old code base or old system to prototype something, you may be preemptively closing doors on ideas of how to do things, because that system was made, like, let's say it's old enough that just nobody would have thought to run a high-res fluid sim at all, because maybe shaders didn't even have that ability. We can go back that far, right? It's like, okay, well, if you decide that looks good, then you're setting a threshold for what you're going to accept that's, maybe a little too low. So for all those reasons, we haven't done that yet. But also though, right, once we program some stuff here and I'm like, oh, this is kind of good. I think this is related to what we can ship. It'll of course get revised a few times. Only at that point do we start figuring out the style of the water in the game, really, because that is when the people on the art team take these tools and say, okay, we're going to start making stuff with this, right? And then we're going to discover like, oh, they want to have this ability and they don't have it, or whatever. Like they should be able to do this thing, or they can do this thing and it should look better than it does. And why doesn't it look that good? Or all that kind of thing comes up. That happens, but when you're creating the technology, that happens after you create the technology.
So I have a different answer to that question.
Go for it.
It's similar to what you just said, but it's a little bit broader, I guess. And that is that when you're talking about defining the look of anything, doesn't really matter what it is, when you're just doing aesthetic experimentation, it's not true that iteration is always fastest and most productive when given to the art team. So artistic iteration is, meaning if the thing that you're talking about is fundamentally based on a sketching or layering kind of process, then artists are fastest because that's their trade. It's using repetitive application of tools to produce a result. But when you're talking about something like water, there really has never been, even in the history of all animation that I know of, including film, a time when primarily the art department produced the water. And the reason for that is water is far too complex for an artist to produce with a brush, pretty much, period. And so what's always happened is you have an iteration process that involves programmers generating tools for artists, and then the artists use those tools and it feeds back on itself. And this has happened even since the very first time that we had fluid dynamics in film. For example, at DreamWorks on, I want to say, Prince of Egypt. This is exactly what happened, and it's gone from there, right? So in the case of John's game specifically, it would make very little sense to ask an artist to iterate on the water because it's very hard for artists to produce water effects. They have to use plugins for their favorite, and I use that term in quotes, Autodesk product that sort of produce water sometimes and oftentimes not very well and often not very controllable and so on and so forth. It takes a tremendous amount of artist time to set up these simulations. It's very difficult for them to do much to them. And they take a long time to render. So the iteration time for your art staff on water effects is usually lower than the iteration time for your programmers. And so typically, if you have programmers with an aesthetic eye on your team, you give them the water sim first, and then you hand it to your artist, not the other way around. If you literally have no programmers who understand what looks good and what don't, then you may be in a situation where you have to hand it to the art team first, but normally that just isn't the decision you would make. And it's not the decision anyone makes, as far as I know. Okay. So here is a question that is, I guess, just someone wanting us to clarify maybe when I was talking about the NVIDIA paper, but the question is, could you elaborate on why you need to multiply two noises to draw the grid instead of using a 3D noise with Z as the time axis? A noise multiplies a noise part. So I can probably take that question unless you want to.
I mean, I'll give a short thing and
Okay.
then you can pick up on it. But there are multiple things going on, right? There's how do you animate it at all, which like the 3D question will answer. But there's also like, you don't want a boring noise function. You want something multi-scale, right? And so you need to create that in some way, I would say. Like we don't, we have very particular desires. Like we don't want large portions of the grid to be erased at one time so that you can't see the lines over a very broad place. But if we just speckle a bunch of little holes around through the lines, then they're going to be pretty consistent. Like there's actually a stylistic balance, right, that we're trying to achieve. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. Okay, that's all I have to say on that.
So what I was going to say is, part of that is just like when you're hacking stuff together, like you're going to make something that happens to look good at the time. My guess is that the grid probably will change because once you have the final water system in, it'll probably become a lot more obvious what actually wants to happen there. And then at that point, it'll be like, yeah, so the way we do it is we sample the water sim, which tells us something about the grid, and then we use some noise on top of that because we want to use some displacement not related to the water, and off we go, right? So I'm guessing even once the grid is like, this is exactly what we want it to be, it probably will come from multiple sources because typically you want sources that both capture underlying phenomenon, which are coming from one system, and ones that are about an authorial input that is about the grid only itself, right? So typically it's not uncommon for wanting to apply multiple inputs to create something because you're trying to capture different opinions about what should happen. Oftentimes one comes from gameplay or comes from simulation and the other comes from tweaking that you want to lay on top of it to maintain certain aesthetic criteria that are separate.
Yeah, and also once we have more stuff, like say we do this other water simulator, or even say we just did the particle one that we have right now, and just beefed it up, got it further along, we would have more material to work with, right? So as long as you've got some model of like some waves that go up and down, right? Then you might be like, well, we can create a more visually integrated scene by using that variation to provide some of the some of the appearance and disappearance for the grid lines that we want, so that we're not multiplying it by some arbitrary external noise function. So like, for example, maybe in the troughs of waves, it fades out, and maybe at the peak, it doesn't fade out. And maybe that by itself isn't like enough to get you to the style that you want, but maybe it's like half or 2/3 of it. And then you can do the rest of it with a noise function that you layer on top of that or something. But the more that you have to work with that, uh, there's a way of making things where everything is related and everything that can be used is used well. And so you should look for those opportunities if you can. And yeah. And so if you say, well, this is our prototype of how the grid lines were done early on and we don't want to change it, then you may miss those opportunities as you improve your implementation of the other things.
So next question is, there seems to be a trade-off between visual realism and gameplay clarity similar to the movement system. However, unlike the movement system, it seems that water will look weirder if non-continuous than character movement. What do you think is a good trade-off, and what are the knobs you could tweak to make the trade-off go one way or the other?
Well, will it look weirder or will it just look stylized, right? So, okay, this is going to be weird because we just redid all our tone mapping and all this stuff, so colors are really messed up. But let me pick something like this. Let me get rid of the extra. So, I mean, here's an island or a set of islands. It's grid based. The gridding is very clear. You don't really have questions about where you can stand on this. If anything, I would say that the little ocean pattern in the background is a little too noisy, like the bubbles pattern. But you can imagine that's part of like me breaking all the ocean shaders and stuff, right? Like the water here used to look a lot better. But just, the point that I want to make is about the land. It's very artificially conforming to grid squares. Like you don't ever expect an island to look like this, but it's stylized and it looks coherent, and the game sells it to you, so it's fine, right? You can do the same thing with water. That's all I have to say about that, I think. I don't
know. So the only thing I would add to that is that as far as knobs are concerned, I think we kind of already talked about that when we were talking about, like, when I was sort of pitching the, like, maybe start with that NVIDIA paper as an example approach. You have a lot of knobs to turn. You have, what do those wave functions look like that you're sampling to create the wave pattern? What's the interpolation fall off that you're using to blend them together? What are you doing on the source coarse mesh, right? So you have tons and tons and tons of knobs. And I guess the meta comment is just, one of the reasons that I went to that first as a method to suggest was specifically because I feel like it has a lot of actual options, which I think is what you want in this kind of scenario.
Yeah. So going back to another island example here for a second, like it's not the case that we just randomly said, let's make islands that look good, and then randomly did something and did it, right? It was like, we experimented, we prototyped, we were like, how square or non-square do we need these to be, right? If they're too square, they look weird. If they're too non-square, then you end up in situations where, it looks like you should be able to get like cross diagonals that you can't actually cross, or, it just looks weird that your character is standing on a square and is actually like halfway in the water, or a block looks like it should fall. And so we weigh all these, given the base technology that we have for this, which is, so first we could place some flat pieces down, right? And then we have like some edge pieces, and there's, I forget how to manipulate it, but there's like a decal layer that's creating all this coloring. So you see, as I move this piece around, there's like a decal being projected on top of it. And okay, there's like this. And then I forget how there's like a little editor where you can splat down the decals in there. So anyway, we had some set of tools for things like this, right? And then even these little lines in the middle, there are art direction rules that we came up with, which is like, look, these can be organic and stuff. That's fine, but they shouldn't ambiguate the grid, right? So these are sort of near the grid lines, and you look at this, and your brain knows where the square is. And here, there's like a dark shaded bit, but it's in the square, and your brain knows where it is, right? If you come along and use these tools to like do this, right? Suddenly you're making a mess, and it's not as good anymore. And if I had more time, I could mess it up more. And so it's not like when you look at a relatively finished thing that's had some thought into it like this, it's easy to just assume that that's what happens when you decide to make an island and quote make it look nice or whatever. But actually, there's a substantial thought process that goes into very specific trade-offs. And so with water, again, you have those same trade-offs, and we haven't been able to make those yet because we haven't really implemented anything that was ready for production yet, right? So all that comes a little later. I forget how that ties into what Casey was saying, but it totally does.
Okay, so someone asked, side note, do you know if that paper helped make the water in Sea of Thieves? I have no idea, but I doubt it, because Sea of Thieves is older than that paper. Next question. Do you have a specific approach when implementing something out of a paper? Sometimes they are quite hand-wavy regarding implementation details.
I've been burned by papers so many times that I just don't trust them. I have a very low opinion of quote computer science unquote papers that claim, like if they're about a mathy part of computer science, I feel like I can depend on them. Like if they're like, this is our proof that it takes of this many steps to do this thing or whatever, or that kind of thing I think is fine. The kind that are like, we got a 12% speed up by doing the following thing. Like almost all of those are garbage. And I've been I've done jobs where even like prior to, I'm thinking of a very specific incidents, but like there had been some new papers out. I'd had friends say, oh yeah, this is great. Little did I know they didn't actually implement them in anything serious. I went and took a contract where I had 1 month to make this thing work, and I couldn't make it work, and there was no other option that would work these days with the amount of experience that I have, I could have cobbled something together, but then I was just like, I failed a contract basically because this research paper sucked and because I didn't know what else to do. So yeah, man, I don't know. Like, and I've had experiences like that several times. I was doing a thing in terrain generation once where there was a paper that claimed to be very fast, and I implemented it, and I was like, oh, it's not that fast actually. And I wrote up a thing about how it wasn't that fast and how you can make it faster. And the author of the paper was like, oh, but these 5 words deep in this paragraph out of this 5 to 7 page paper, there's 5 words that suggest something that maybe solve this problem. And I'm like, dude, I can tell you didn't do this work, and you didn't publish it in the source code, and you don't know how much this actually makes you faster or not. So like I don't know, just too many bad experiences. The incentives for the people who publish these papers are all wrong. So the answer is just, if I'm going into implementing a paper, it's with extreme skepticism and an expectation that it may not work, and that I certainly wouldn't ever do it on a deadline anymore. And then it's with the expectation that I may have to use the paper just as a starting point and as a source of maybe ideas of how to do things, and then branch away from that in terms of actually doing something that's good.
So let me take a quick second to answer one of the questions that sort of popped up that's really easy to answer really quickly. And it was, so you have the procedural method you have now, more or less, and you have the baked method provided by NVIDIA. Couldn't you use something similar to the way a specular reflection map works to blend between the two, or is that what we're saying already? So yeah, just to be clear, if it wasn't already, the NVIDIA paper is backed by a sim. So if you want to, you can just use the simulation as your course grid or blend the simulation between painted and simmed however you want. It's not like the NVIDIA paper is baked. It's actually not. The NVIDIA paper is a sim and then upsampling. And it's the upsampling part where you add in the fine detail waves. That's what's going on, basically. Okay. Let's see. So I think one person said, can you show the water in the other more complete levels and talk about what goes on there? I think that's what you kind of just have on the screen right now, right?
I mean, all the water is basically wrecked compared to how it looked. Like this water here looked a lot better 2 weeks ago, and it's just in part, like you can see how it's maybe, oh, if I turn off my face again, you can see how it's a little shiny in the upper right corner and maybe looks a little bit like somebody put effort in at one point. Like it used to look a lot more like that. It's just like changing all the tone mapping process and thus the calibration of all the materials in the entire game. Like we changed our dynamic range, and then I broke the water. Like all sorts of things have happened. So we have approximately 0 examples anymore of water that's actually supposed to be trying to look good. Which is then why this is a good time to sort of pick it up and go again so that we have like something,
So this is now, I think we're just down to kind of broader questions. There's one more that I guess I can sort of answer. There's a question that says, how about a detailed enough cellular automata that represents pressure for the water, 16 by 16 per tile, for example? So that is what a water sim is. Cellular automata and finite element systems are basically just the same kind of idea. They are, to be a little bit more complete. So there's 2 ways you can think of simulations, or 2 main methods that you use. One is called Eulerian and one's called Lagrangian. Eulerian methods are ones that operate on a fixed grid or a fixed set of points, and Lagrangian methods are ones that operate on points that move around in space. And then there are mixed models which use a combination of the 2. That's like when you get things, a popular method, for example, is a modern method would be material point methods, which are mixed methods that use a mix of the 2. Cellular automata is just one word for the update step on an Eulerian update model. So if you have a grid that has quantities represented on the grid, cellular automata is a thing that says, look, I just look at the neighbors to this grid and I have a basically binary composite rule that just gives me here's the output of the thing. It doesn't involve actually solving anything on the grid or even attempting to solve anything on the grid. Real fluid dynamics is basically cellular automata taken up a notch, right? It's you actually have equations that you're trying to solve and you try to structure your grid update step to produce actual approximations to solutions of equations on the grid that you want to be true. Water in particular, this is important because water is an incompressible fluid as opposed to, say, smoke, which is not. What that means is water, when you push on it, it comes out the other end, right? It can't become more dense. It has to move. If you push on one end of water, it comes out the other end. That's just how water works. It's incompressible. It can't be made to occupy higher densities in some places and lower densities in others, as opposed to, say, smoke or other gaseous phenomena. So as a result, it's very important that you have something that approximates some kind of fluid simulation if you actually want to simulate water, because it has to simulate the effect of fairly rapidly propagating the water across the grid so that things, when you push on one side, they need to come out the other side, and they can't just get denser in the middle and kind of stick there, which is something the cellular automata would generally do. So I guess what I would say is what you're talking about is exactly what we're talking about. Fluid sims are fundamentally like the next level of cellular automata already. Is that a fair assessment, John, would you say?
It's not exactly my area of expertise.
Mine neither.
So what Casey said is fine as far as,
Okay, next question is, do you have any hard and fast rules about creating tools for team members to use? Things like everything must be undoable, etc.
Well, I mean, everything has to be undoable. I got mad once when somebody did some basic stuff that wasn't like, especially when like somebody who shall not be named right now, in part because you shouldn't even be talking about this in public at all. But something that happened that made me kind of upset was somebody decide, okay, um, there's a way, there's a general system that I've been using for entity management going back many years, right? And actually, at Handmade Con this one time, I talked to Casey about it a little bit because we were talking about serialization and deserialization, and like I think I went into some details. Maybe I actually did a follow-up stream. I think that's what happened was I posted a follow-up stream on YouTube because we didn't go into as much detail as we could. But anyway, it is just a way of arranging how do you serialize, how do you deserialize, how do you memory manage. So like if there are strings on entities that you need to be able to type in and change in the editor, right? Like someone needs to know that that's a string that needs to get freed when the entity is destroyed or whatever, right? And so how does all that work? Well, sometimes people make decisions that are really annoying. So, okay, so for example, serialization and deserialization is how undo works. So if you want to change the texture map on an entity, right? And then you control Z that change, the entity comes back and it looks like what it did before because you undid the change to the string field. And then uh, it looks up the name of the texture. Like when you undo something, there's a little like, hey, reinitialize this guy because he came out of the undo system, and whatever you might need to do to be able to get him live again, do that. And so, for example, the name of the texture map on the thing is in a string field, and then when you make the entity live or whatever, when you make it active, you look up that texture in the asset list, and then you put that texture well, whatever. Now you have a pointer to a texture instead of a string, and you can use that to render the guy, right? Hopefully people out there know what I'm talking. Very, very standard thing. So in past engines, I always did that as two very explicit separate steps. There's a string field, and then you look up the texture later because I like the clarity of that and the lack of ambiguity. Now for this engine, we're doing some experiments like, well, you have better metadata for things. Maybe we can just realize that something's a pointer to a texture and just not store the string field. But that introduced a bunch of difficulties. But somebody decided to do that change and didn't sufficiently think about it, and it caused a lot of problems. That if it were me doing it, I like to think I would have at least thought of most of those problems or found them within the few days of playing around with this major change that I would have done before exporting it to the team. So for example, let's say you typo a texture name, right? When you're in the editor, and what happens? Does it give you a null texture back? If it gives you a null texture back, there's no record of what you typed because there's no string field. And now how do you correct your typo without retyping the whole freaking thing, right? If a texture pointer goes into undo, did you do the manual work of pulling that back out of undo, right? Or did you just just say, oh, it's fine, just somebody has to type the texture name again if you undo it, right? There was a third one that was important. What if you type the name of a texture field first and then you want to hot load the texture second, which was something you could do before just fine? Does that work now, right? So when you make a change like that, like at least don't break things. At least make sure that everything is good, especially if the change that you're making is sort of academic at some level. Like it's not really academic. It's like, it's maybe a little bit more efficient, sort of, or like you don't have to have 2 copies of data or something. But the team, the artists, and including me, the designer at the time, wants to just be able to do stuff. not like have crap breaking on us all the time. And so when you make a change like that, here's what I would say is you shouldn't make changes to code that people use unless you use that yourself and know what it's going to do and know what the failure modes are, which is a little bit easier said than done because everybody uses tools a little differently. I use the editor in the game all the time. I use it in a different way than the artists do. There's a lot of things they do that I don't do. There's a lot of things I do that they don't do. So it's very hard to get complete coverage on that. But like, you shouldn't be messing that stuff up, right? Like if you, and then again, an extra part of the problem is just, even though I tell people, hey, bug us if there's a problem, they often won't because they just work around it, or they know that we're all super busy and have other stuff to do. And so then, we go 8 months to a year with like some major stupid problem that caused everybody a lot of headache that like could have been fixed in, 2 hours or something a year ago, and it didn't get fixed. And then the more you're in an environment where there's more of those problems happening, the more people just expect those problems and won't notify you about them, right? And so I don't know. It's not easy because at the same time, if you're a small independent developer, there's a reality on a limit to how much work you can do. So you really can't address some of these sometimes for a while. But you especially don't want to be, as an individual engineer, you don't want to be pushing that in the wrong direction, right? You don't want to be making that stuff worse. If you do, then it's not a good scene.
So, next question is, are there any level design ideas that involve realistic fluid mechanics like conservation of mass, hydraulic jumps, Venturi effect, etc.?
For this game, no. It's just not what the game is.
And then the last question I think we had was, what do you do when you think that there is no solutions to the problem you have?
I give up, cancel the game, and quit the game industry. What do you think? I mean, that's what all successful people do, right?
I don't think I've ever actually seen a problem where I didn't think there was some solution to it, because fundamentally speaking, games are about, usually finding the right approximations to solutions. Like, we don't really need to simulate water as water actually behaves. We just need to make something that we think is aesthetically pleasing, and there's many axes you can explore to get there. So usually,
can we ask for an example? Yeah, from this questionnaire about what is an unsolvable problem?
That's a good point. What would be an example of a problem that has no solution? The halting problem. Yeah, thankfully we don't generally need that in game design.
No, even the halting problem, right? Like, so all of these things have solutions. They're just not naive solutions.
A tweet everyone agrees with. That's the best answer.
Well, I mean, I had some less politically correct ones, but in terms of like actual non-social problems, let's say, right? So like halting problem even seems impossible, right? But the way that you approach that kind of a thing is you step back, right? And you make your universe of discourse be a thing that contains the halting problem that is bigger, so that you know how to like deal with the halting problem, you know where it comes up, and you know how to employ it to solve things, right? So like, I don't know, like solving problems is not always the thing that makes some people a lot better than other people at solving problems is the ability to not just sit there and grind on the obvious things, and to have some imagination about what do you actually do here to improve this situation. Do we have a non-joke answer to that?
I don't think so.
Because I'm interested, because sometimes when people ask that question,
they have something in mind. Yeah,
they're working on their own game and they're like, man, I was trying to do this thing and it didn't. Of course, other times it's just people want to ask a question, right? And it doesn't. Doesn't make sense.
I don't see a non-joke answer, really.
All right, well, Twitch chat. Do I recall the title? I just saw a question going, but that's off topic.
Oh, someone asked, Casey, you didn't give an answer to the implementing papers question. You seem to be fairly up to date with papers, so I think you are less skeptical. So I think I actually answered this question at HandmadeCon as well in the Q&A session at HandmadeCon 2016. I actually have a complete answer to it, but for me, I just basically go and I crawl all the research for the past 10 years or so, and I look at it all, and I basically go, okay, what is the breakdown of the way that people are solving these problems? And usually you can luck out, and there'll be some survey papers which you can use to like crawl the bibliographies for, but even generic like non-papers that are just making some random contribution to the field typically have a giant related work section that basically has a bibliography that can get you most of the way there. And so I feel like typically what happens is as you start to read enough of these papers, you get a pretty good idea of where the actual seminal work was. And it's pretty rare for seminal papers not to actually explain how they frickin' work. It's usually like later papers that don't explain what the heck is going on. And they just like have a bunch of random nomenclature thrown in for no reason. I think part of this is because people who crack the problem first tend to be the kind of thinkers who usually can explain the problem to other people, most of the time I find. So by the time I've looked through enough of the back story, I find there's not that much that I can't grapple with, and then it's just a question of sitting down and actually working through it on with pen and paper or code, right? And it takes a little while. Like you've got to sit down because especially with fluid dynamics, you're going to see a bunch of partial differential equations, and those aren't my strong suit anyway. So I got to sit there and go like, okay, like what's this actually saying? Like, oh, okay, I see, whatever. So that part is going to be slow no matter what you do, but generally I find it's fine. And most of the time, I don't think of that process is I'm going to sit down and implement this paper. I think of that process is I'm using the research to help me decide what I'm going to implement. And what I end up implementing tends to not be from any one paper. It tends to be what I think will then solve my problem using all of the tools that all of these people have discovered in their attempts, because now I get it, right? So typically, I don't look at research papers as something to implement anyway. That's just not what I do. I tend to think of research papers as educating me about what people have tried so that then I can figure out what I want to try. And it saves me a tremendous amount of time because I'm basically getting all of their work that I don't have to do because they experimented with something and came up with a thing. And now I don't have to spend the time experimenting to come up with that thing. I may have to experiment to come up with other things, but not that one because they already did it. So there's one more here. It seems more important that still water remains still in the entire still tile than flowing water remains flowing in the entire flow tile as long as there is some flow. If you want to sim, you could pretend all still squares are filled in and do sim of the flowing squares only. Because waves can be summed, you can do a non-flowing somewhat still simulation with all water tiles, ignoring any flow they may have. Add those two layers together to get the final waves. So that's not that dissimilar to what was going on with the NVIDIA paper, right? It's just like a little bit better version of that.
No, but I can imagine, like, if your constraint was you have to use the code that's already here in the game and just finish it up, that could be a way to do it. And honestly, though, you might even right now, if I go back to this level, well, right now everything's real quiet because I just started it, but one of the, we'll put Casey's face on. One of the things that happens after it warms up a little bit, and by the way, that's one of the annoying things about this particular thing is like how long do you have to run it before it's in a steady state? But so the way we sim these particles is the particles get accelerated way extra if they're inside the gameplay flow, and then not so much if they're outside. And of course, they have a continuous acceleration across those boundaries because you don't want to see like velocity discontinuities. But they could just be heavily, heavily damped in a way that they actually aren't, right? And so that would solve. So um, this place where it's among the worst. So if you see this, the question then is,
Uh-oh.
do you get something that's good?
I feel like John's internet may be dying.
Well, I don't know what to say.
Now you're returning. You have returned, John.
Okay,
You've
great.
been
Well,
resurrected.
I said basically everything I think that I was going to say there.
I don't think anyone heard it.
Okay. Well, it's just to say we could damp the stuff artificially, um, but like there's a sense in which when you do that, you are uh, you are implementing things that are counter to the good thing that you're supposedly getting out of the system, right? And so then what are you have to question your core thesis that this is a good way to do it if you're then going and subtracting a lot of that, like if I just ran a water sim on the background, that might be a little better actually than damping things, because at least then the flow directions would not be super related. um but then would it just be weird because it's going in a totally weird direction? I don't know.
Um, so someone had a kind of a interesting suggestion that I think is worth mentioning, sort of broadened perhaps a little bit, which is, could the riverbed play a more prominent role and be more or less shallow and explain why water moves or doesn't? And I kind of like that idea. It's like, could the underwater features be structured in a way to help explain why the water does what it does? And the only problem I think you'd run into there is, because the river changes course based on player action, it becomes harder. If the player couldn't do that, then you could try to construct the underwater area to reinforce what's going on, but that becomes harder when it can change.
Well, also the thing to realize is the underwater, for these rivers that you can see that are going right to left, for example, if you draw what's at the bottom of that empty square of stuff, it's almost on the next grid square, at this angle. And so if you can see that clearly, now you start having features that seem like coherent physical features that are in the wrong place for you to like be looking at them. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like if you look at the yellow stones that are there,
Yeah.
just sort of inside that nook, I have the water tuned right now to be very heavily damping of them visually. You can see them if you look real close. But part of that is just to make it very clear, like what square are these in? And if you start to lose that, then the question is, does this thing help you enough to make that worth it? And the answer is probably no in that case, especially because we want to have custom like little visuals along the bottom that help create the setting for any particular level. And like now, do those have to be destructible or something in case you make an ocean go over it? Like, I don't even know. So I don't think that would be high on the list of things to entertain. That said, once you start going down these routes of alternative solutions to things, sometimes you enter a space where it's like, oh, I didn't think ideas like that made sense, but now I totally see how they do. So I wouldn't totally rule it out either.
So I think that's all the questions.
Okay.
Shall
If
we?
that's it, we got away much lighter this time. It was only 3 hours. And
That's a
less
good
than
length.
that if you count the 20 to 20 hours of messing with the stream that we did at
Yes,
the beginning.
yes. There was a lot of you trying to not make OBS drop all the frames.
Yeah, that was really great.
All right.
All right, everybody, thank you for coming by. If you missed parts of this, the video will be up on YouTube later on. You can, of course, go to Handmade Hero at twitch.tv/handmade_hero to see Casey work on really amazing water simulation every day. Maybe
Or not at
not,
all.
or not at all.
Yeah.
You're still doing light stuff now, right? Or is that?
Yeah, light propagation
you
is really
done?
hard to do good and fast.
That's true.
It's. I said it at the beginning. I was like, this is going to be the worst thing we have to do, and I was right, unsurprisingly.
All right. Well, if you want to do light propagation instead of water propagation, you can go there.
They're pretty similar, except one has. Yeah. Well, I won't even go down that route.
I don't think they're that similar. All right. Bye, everybody.
Take it easy.